Welcome to the Great Basin Seasonal Outlook for April through July. Currently, we still have prescribed fire activity ongoing across the Great Basin. However, we have had some wildfires pop up, relatively small, which is normal for the time of year. We have seen some up in northern Nevada, also southwest Idaho, and some of these fires were 50 to 100 acres. Again, most of that is in the carryover dormant grasses from last year. So as we see green up continue to increase across northern areas, that will limit some of the fire danger, but there will still be some of these dead fine fuels from last season that still could carry some fire, especially on windy days. Over the last 14 days, we've seen precipitation in the northern areas of the Great Basin and also down into eastern Nevada and northern and central Utah, and also in the Sierra. But you can see from the image on the right, any of this precipitation really is below normal for the time of year for this 2-week period, with the exceptions of a few spots in Utah and parts of southern Idaho and Wyoming. Looking at the last 30 days, we've seen cooler temperatures over the western half of the Great Basin and warmer temperatures over the eastern areas, and precipitation has been generally well below normal across the periphery of the Great Basin. The only exceptions are more in the interior, from central and northern Nevada over towards northern Utah, southeast Idaho, and Wyoming, that have seen above normal precipitation. Looking at the precipitation back to October 1st, the beginning of the water year, and you can see it's still generally below normal precipitation across the Great Basin, especially over southern areas. The only areas that have seen near or above normal precipitation have been far northwest Nevada into southwest Idaho. Parts of southeast Idaho and Wyoming have seen near normal precipitation as well, but again, the heavier precipitation really has been into the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. Looking at our snowpack, even though we have seen below normal precipitation, our snowpack is near normal for the time of year in all areas except for the far south, which has been below normal all season. We did have some storms move through in February and March that did temporarily increase that snowpack, but that should melt off pretty quickly since it's been generally below normal through the year. But again, over northern areas, even though the snowpack is near or even just above normal, we have many areas that are still in a deficit with respect to seasonal precipitation. Looking at our drought monitor, this kind of makes sense with some of the precipitation. Obviously, our driest areas over the last 6 months have been over southern areas of the Great Basin, and this is where we are seeing severe to extreme drought and even some areas of exceptional drought in the far south. Further north, we have no drought over northern Nevada into southwest Idaho, which is where the precipitation has been near or above normal for the season. But we have seen drought develop over parts of central Idaho, especially in the Salmon Chalice, and over towards western Wyoming. So again, even though these areas have seen near normal snowpack, really through much of the season, it has been a drier type snow, so precipitation overall is still below normal. So again, those are some areas in the north that will be concerning later this summer. Otherwise, looking at the drought outlook, you can see a very little change expected in the drought. We should see the drought continue in all the areas it currently is in, and probably no expectations for drought development over parts of southern Idaho into northern Nevada. Looking at the evaporative demand drought index, this is more our shorter term changes in drought, and you can see with the storm systems we have moving by across the north that we don't really see any short-term drought concerns in northern areas, and even over southern areas, despite the longer term drought with some precipitation we did see recently, we're not seeing any strong signatures of any type of flash drought or short-term drought changes, at least not currently. So looking at how our drought affects our fire seasons, this is for Nevada, but it's really representative of most of our lower elevation areas in the Great Basin. Looking at our drought time series back to the year 2000, you can see where we have our longer periods of significant drought across the Great Basin, separated by shorter areas where we either have no drought or minimal drought. And you can see the areas where we have the black boxes, that's typically where we burn above normal acreage in Nevada in the lower elevations and in many of our lower elevation areas up in southern Idaho and northern Utah when we see these periods of drought. You can see where we are now. We are just starting to enter drought in some of the Great Basins. So again, this would be a more concerning time period, especially since we didn't burn much in the way of acreage last year when we were sitting in this area of no drought, just due to very hot and dry conditions and minimal lightning. So we are anticipating that page will turn this season, and we are expecting another above normal fire potential year in some areas of the Great Basin. So on the flip side, looking at when we have significant drought, this is typically when we see our higher elevation fires, our more prolonged fires, our team fires. You can see back in 2013, this is kind of a similar situation to where Southern Nevada is sitting right now, where we had the Carpenter 1 fire. We have a slew of other fires across the Great Basin that occur in years of deep drought. And again, these are more either our higher elevation or mid elevation fires and could tend to be a little bit more problematic. So even though the acreage may not show that for an above normal year, we do have concerns when we have areas of drought in certain areas. So looking at some of our fuel conditions, this was our experimental fine fuel condition graphic from last year. So this is going into the 2024 season. We won't see any of these new graphics until later in the spring, but this is just showing where our carryover would be concerning coming from where we had it last year. So looking on the image on the left, this is the standing dead fine fuel plus the 2024 fine fuel growth. So areas in the brighter greens, those are obviously where we have more fine fuel loading going into last season. So that would be parts of northern Nevada into southwest Idaho. Really very minimal fine fuel growth combined with carryover in most other areas. Looking at the image on the right, this is just showing the estimated invasive species coverage. So this is not fuel loading, but it's more continuity. So even though fuel loading might not be high, we do have continuous fuels. And again, some of those areas, even into western Nevada, but also mainly northern Nevada into southwest Idaho, and even parts of western Utah. So those will be some of the areas we'll be focusing on going into at least the mid to later part of the fire season. So looking at some of our current fuel conditions, our 10-hour fuel moistures with the cooler, wetter systems currently moving across the north, our 10-hour fuel moistures are low, so no real concerns there. Obviously, the drier spots are in the southern areas of the Great Basin, and we're seeing this with 100 and 1,000-hour fuels as well, which is, again, more of what we look at during the fire season. Things still aren't critical, but they are obviously drier on the southern areas where we haven't seen as much precipitation, and really minimal concerns currently up north. So looking at some of the fuel charts, this is the 100-hour fuel moisture. So looking at southeast Utah, which is where conditions have been certainly on the drier side. The 100-hour fuel moisture are near minimums for the time of year, historical minimums. However, again, as you can see, they're still well above the threshold, so nothing critical across the Great Basin, but we are seeing, again, those drier than normal fuels in southern areas. Looking at western areas of the Great Basin, fuel conditions are really near normal for the time of year. So again, that's certainly well outside of critical. And as we go further north, that's where we're seeing our fuel conditions either near or above normal. So putting everything together, we've looked at our past conditions. Now we'll look at some of the forecasts going forward. This is the 7-day total precipitation expected across the U.S. So for the Great Basin, you can see as the storms move through this week, and then again, possibly towards the middle of the month, but this is really accounting for the storm systems that we'll see moving through over the next couple of days. The highest total precipitation will be in the Sierra and the higher elevations, but in other areas of the Great Basin, still seeing over a half inch or over 3/4 of an inch of liquid equivalent precipitation, some areas over an inch, especially in the higher terrain. And obviously a lot of that will be in the form of snow in some of the mid and higher elevations. Looking at some of the drier spots, still continue to be southern Nevada, even southern and southeast Utah. Any precipitation they see will be very light in the lower elevations. The 8 to 14-day outlook taking us through April 13th shows warmer and drier conditions. So after these storm systems move through early in the month, we will see a break in precipitation with warmer temperatures, but we are seeing some signs towards mid-April of another series of low pressure systems moving through the Great Basin. So it looks like the drier, warmer period will be somewhat short-lived and then return from mid to late month. This is the model estimated total precipitation through April 15th. Again, this is a model, so taking it with a grain of salt. However, you can see we are obviously expecting a wetter period, both early in the month and then again towards the middle portion of the month, where most areas will see good amounts of precipitation, especially in the higher terrain. So we will continue to see at least some snowfall and cooler temperatures, so this will delay the melting of the snow, so we're not looking at any rapid melt-off, at least not certainly in the next month. Some of the drier spots still continue to be southern areas of the Great Basin. Even parts of the Snake River Plain won't get quite as much precipitation as other areas. Again, there will be some pockets where precipitation will be on the light side, but for the most part, we should at least see unsettled weather, keeping our fire danger conditions relatively low. So this is the official Predictive Services outlook for April through July for temperature and precipitation. So looking at April, eventually as we get later in the month, we will see these stormy conditions moderate and we will see warmer and drier conditions most likely return. This will continue probably into May, although we will have some storm systems, so not an overly dry signature for the western half of the Great Basin, meaning we'll probably have some periods of dry weather, but also still some active weather potentially going into May, which is definitely good news for the start of our fire season. Any continued moisture throughout the spring will at least delay the onset of fire season, but that will also keep us watching the fine fuel growth. We were already starting to see some grasses grow in parts of northern Nevada and southern Idaho this last week where it was warmer later in March. So as that returns and we actually start our official green up through April and May, we'll be watching some of those fine fuel conditions and where most of our target areas will be. And then looking at the meat of fire season heading into July, you can see still very warm temperatures expected throughout June and July and mostly drier conditions. As we look at the monsoon, right now, monsoon forecasts are really showing more of an on-time schedule for the arrival of the monsoon. So moving into southern areas of Arizona and New Mexico in June, and then moving up into far southern areas of the Great Basin by July would be normal timing. Right now, we're still looking for probably a below normal precipitation, at least for the early onset of the monsoon. So there are some concerns with this warmer, drier pattern and maybe not quite as much monsoon moisture in June, heading into at least early July. But it looks like that moisture should move into southern areas of the Great Basin by July. So we'll then be pushing our focus mostly up north later in the fire season. So putting everything together, our outlook for the Great Basin, we're expecting normal fire potential throughout April and May. So that would be generally a gradual uptick in smaller fires, gradually increasing in size going into May, but no significant large fire potential, especially as we see moisture throughout April, possibly into May, and then green up occurring. So overall, we'll see generally normal conditions and probably a normal start to our fire season with respect to timing right now. So obviously, fire season will generally start from south to north. We are expecting some above normal fire potential in the fire season as we head into June in the south. Again, looking at the well below normal precipitation, the snowpack is very low down in southern areas, so that should melt off very quickly with a curing of the fuels happening throughout May and June. So we will be concerned with especially our mid to higher elevations in southern areas, especially again due to the low precipitation, but also the severe to extreme drought conditions happening in those areas. So we're not really anticipating any concerns with fine fuel, certainly no new fine fuel growth in the south this year, just with the drier conditions and not much carryover to speak of. So most of the concerns early in the season will be mid to higher elevations in southern areas of the Great Basin. Now, as we head into July, we are expecting that monsoon moisture to push into southern areas, so possibly a return to normal fire potential by July for southern areas of the Great Basin, but then the focus just shifts to the north. And by July, we'll still be mostly drying out in June, heading into early July. But our concerns are with the above normal carryover and fine fuel growth we're expecting in northern Nevada and southwest Idaho. That to be a hotspot for larger fire potential by July. And then also parts of the Salmon Chalice, maybe later in July. The snowpack, even though it's normal with the precipitation well below normal, that should melt off pretty quickly heading through June and July. So that might be the only area of central Idaho that would be an initial concern for above normal fire potential. Once we get into August, that will certainly change potentially in some areas. But right now, this is kind of what we're looking at for July. We'll also have to keep a close eye on western Wyoming, though some of those areas have below normal precip and drought developing there as well. So looking at overall, you can see the progression from April through July of our fire potential outlook. And again, starting in the south and then attention definitely shifting further north. And many of these areas in northern Nevada and southwest Idaho, although we had a pretty good fine fuel crop last year. Did not see many fires and certainly no big, large fires in those areas. So plenty of fuel to burn heading into this year. And again, we'll continue to monitor that fine fuel growth heading through the spring. That concludes our outlook for this month. Check back next month for the latest updates.